this is going to be a really simple session, is my hope. In essence, the really so I don't know, how many people are familiar what happened with table features when OVS decided to expose table features to Open Daylight? Anybody know what? So does anybody experience this? Okay, so OBS in like 2.4 I think added table features. They actually responded with, and they never did it in the past because they literally just said, we have 256 tables. All the tables have all of the things. Why are you even asking me? And so they actually exposed it, and the result was that the Yang JSON rendering of all 256 tables with all possible options turned on was like 4 megabytes of JSON data per switch. All loaded into the inventory model in Open Daylight. So if you queried the inventory model, you could very easily end up querying like tens of megabytes to hundreds of megabytes of data. So this is sort of not, that point problem has obvious solutions, and we just it'd be a type of a knob where you can turn off table features being rendered in the JSON. It's kept internally as state and used for things, but it's not actually rendered in a way that you can get via RESTCONF. But like the general problem of like, we have a massive, massive data store that can store almost arbitrary quantities of information, and we have no clean way to ask for subsets of it except by subtree. So like you pass me a subtree, a path, and I will give you the entire subtree underneath that path. And that is not what most people, I mean, it's fine for common cases. It's not so great for the general case. And so I think we just really and I've heard this a lot, both internally at Brocade and from others, that like, you know, having some kind of querying or filtering support over RESTCONF, since RESTCONF is the API that most people end up using to program to Open Daylight, would be really, really, really nice. And I don't really know, and I have some ideas about how you might go about implementing it and where you would put it, and whether you, I mean, you could use XPath queries, you could use, you know, just simple, regex queries. I don't really know over the path, but I'm hoping that so I have a problem statement. I don't really have a proposed solution, and I'm sort of curious. You could even do the querying at the RESTCONF level? Do you do it at the DOM data store level? I don't know. And so there are people, and I think there are mics somewhere. I think there are 2 mics on that table in the back if people want to talk, since it's being recorded, and if you're mic'd up, it'll help. But I'll just open that up. That's sort of the problem statement, some general idea of what we would like to do. And I don't know if people have comments, questions, or ideas in order to sort of help push that. And I can grab mics from over there on that table if people want them. Nothing?
Yeah, go ahead and code in the filter.
Yes. Well, so I mean, like, so the question would be, you know, like, so basically, you know, there's a query filter language question. So like, what query filter language would you like to use? And I don't know. I mean, there's XPath, which I guess is, and I don't even know if it's capitalized correctly. Given that we have basically a DOM data tree, it seems like XPath is an obvious choice. I don't know how much people like or dislike XPath.
Colin, 2 questions. First of all, if you're getting a RESTCONF query, you can make it down to a more deeper container, right?
That doesn't actually solve the problem. I'll explain mine in a second.
No, sorry. Yeah. So what I was trying to say was, you can probably make a query down to a deeper level in the containers. But then another part, maybe, are you interested in 2 separate parts of the tree, like something in one container and something else in a completely different container?
Well, and so neither one of, so yes is the answer, possibly. I think in the short version, it's just a matter of how do you suppress data you don't want to see. And querying down to a deeper level in the tree doesn't actually help you, in the sense that, like, if I need to get a leaf that's at the same level as the features table list was, I can't get that leaf without also pulling all the table features information through with me. So there are instances where I literally am incapable. There is no query to RESTCONF that will give me the data that I want and exclude the data that I don't want. it is impossible to do in sort of the construction of RESTCONF, which is it's not to say that RESTCONF is wrong. It's just to say, like, if you don't want to download 10 megabytes of data and you want to get that leaf, you get to pick one.
And you could be like asking for that same leaf across like 100 different nodes.
Yeah, in which case you would then have to get,
100 different queries.
100 different queries, each of which, and each of which is going to return you megabytes of data.
So one thing I would add is a potential is adding XSL, XSL, and Exquila, I think it is, the W3C XSL, XQI, LLA.
Is that right?
Yeah, it's as close as I can remember it being.
So I mean, so yeah, and I'm not, I don't really, and I don't really have, this is not my area of expertise. I know that we have a problem, and that sort of, we really need to get through it. XPath is what I know. I don't know what other query languages are worth looking at.
So XSL uses XPath and wraps it to do what you were saying, which is allows you to traverse multiple branches and multiple trees and put things together based on conditional information. And Exquila is an implementation, I believe, of that engine that does those things. And it's, there's a Java version of it now, and it's a WCF source.
Okay, and then,
It would operate on a DOM tree pretty natively.
and so there's also, yes, so there's the query filter language. The other one is like, where to do the querying and filtering. And so like, and I'll just, and if there are other things, people should speak up. Like,
So the immediate question is, do we need queries that select the data across trees, or is cutting down the depth of a query sufficient? Because RESTCONF already has a built-in parameter to essentially query a subtree and only return a certain depth. So that would be an OAuth on our side.
So the depth parameter isn't implemented in our RESTCONF.
Are you sure?
Yes.
In the -15 thing?
I don't know in the draft 15. In the draft 2 implementation, I am 100% certain because I remember when somebody commented out both the code that implemented it and the test that ensured that it stayed there.
Right, because so the reason I'm asking is that so first of all, this is RESTCONF, so if we are missing something that is in the spec and we don't implement it, so that would be the first thing to address. And then adding, it really boils down to how do you push that query using RESTCONF, and that sounds like an extension to the specification to me, which is something that we probably can prototype, but we'll need to upstream it to IETF to really make it a standardized interface.
And so I'm trying to remember, and is Evan here? And so maybe you guys can tell me, I asked about depth, and is depth just not, I remember depth not helping, the depth parameter not helping when you were trying to get like the topology in particular, because like you couldn't get,
So can we get an example of what we are trying to get out of which model, so that we can kind of throw some darts on it? I mean, yeah, sure. Selecting all the features for all the switches should be possible. Are we searching for, say, all switches which have a particular flow installed, or what is it exactly that we are querying for?
And so I think the answer is both. The answer is like, people found lots of value in the XSQL project, which is now, I mean, like, no, I'm not kidding. I mean, like, it's now defunct. But adding that sort of as a fundamental, like, part of making it exposed via REST, which is where everybody else uses it, seems like it'd be useful. But I think the more critical short-term problem is how is it that I can get consistently get reasonably sized responses to my queries, so that way I don't accidentally suck in a million entries of things. And I think the answer is it's technically possible if you do if you're willing to do lots of queries and you limit the depth parameter, right? I mean, like.
Right, but my point is that there are different surfaces that we need to cross when implementing this, right? So understanding of what is it that we want to achieve and not boil the ocean is very important in order to have something that we can deliver in a reasonable time frame.
Yeah, and so I'm trying to think. So just and so I'm going to look at this table because these people are part. I think people have had some of the issue. Do we know if it would be sufficient to have just the depth parameter and query deeper? I seem to remember asking that question and then having somebody tell me I was wrong and being convinced that I was wrong afterwards. Like, but does the question make sense?
Yeah, start with something simple, because the other one where you actually want to maybe query across multiple subtrees and doing that kind of thing, you have to have a piece of code in there that understands the models, can translate the query into actually multiple requests in multiple subtrees, which are all model driven. And if you don't want to hardwire the code, you need something that basically sucks in the schemas and kind of can work with the schemas and work with the schemas.
Yeah, so effectively, yes, we do want to have a query language in RESTCONF, sure. But the thing is, if the each we're trying to scratch is the size of the document which is returned, we can certainly implement it inside RESTCONF. Now, if that means pulling in all the data from all the shards towards a particular node, that's gonna push the project, the problem down one layer, and then the question becomes, well, what do we do next? So clearly scoping what is it that we really need, and mapping out what do we want to do and in what time frames is critical, right? Because essentially the enhancement bug for having XPath/XQuery for listeners has been there for 2 years. Trouble is implementing it efficiently, right? And crossing shards and similar may be a challenge which is difficult if we don't want to implement our own XQuery or XPath engine.
So I'm trying. So if the answer is, so the answer is I think we have two different things we want to do. I'm trying to remember. I'm trying to walk through the example, and I think it was around querying the nodes and links in the topology where it was exceedingly inefficient to be able to iteratively explore the tree. With it, like, so essentially you had to essentially had to set the depth parameter to. The problem is, like, when do you set the depth parameter and how far down do you set it to avoid getting? And the other thing is you run into augmentations, which tend to kill you. So you have to basically set the depth parameter to like n-1, figure out what's there. Then you essentially end up implementing a breadth-first search over REST to be able to get sane query sizes, which is really ugly and slow, depending on how you get it implemented, right? Does that make sense, right? Because you can't.
Yes, it does. But the thing is, the key point is boiling the ocean, right? I understand the Eden solution, right? But getting there is not going to be a two-week solution, and preferably we want to have a quick win to have something, and a path and a set of requirements that kind of need to be explored by the projects involved, because it's not just one project.
One thing I like to point out is in kind of quote-unquote regular REST, you would be able to tailor these REST calls to do exactly what you like to want with the granularity, but you would have to write code for each single one of them, right? So now if we were to do this query engine, would you actually just basically implement these queries as code that you plug in? No, absolutely. I mean, that's not the ideal way. You want to do it in a generic way, and if you want to do it in a generic way, then you have to, there's a complexity of yet another MD-SAL order of magnitude, where basically, you've got to be model driven and you've got to be able to work with the schemas.
There
right?
are really good DOM-oriented querying languages and query engines which we implement, which are not schema aware, but that sort of doesn't. If you want to do the simplest thing first, I mean, you could literally, for example, just to be a really simple don't boil the ocean thing, do a RESTCONF query, get the XML, then, from the controller, if you're trying to protect the client from getting tons of data, you're not necessarily trying to protect the controller, then you could run an XPath query over it, or an X query over it, and return that subset of the results back. And so literally make it as a layer, like a separate service outside the controller. That would be something you could do. And it would be easy, and it would be like essentially a trivial compilation of a couple of different tools. It doesn't solve the load on the server problem. And that's sort of what I was trying to get at here. So basically, outside the controller. So basically, this is you could basically get the XML, run query, return result, and basically then you have like client is protected from gobs and gobs of data. Only has to pass over localhost. So like that's sort of, right, like that would be something that would be really, really simple. It would solve some of the objective. Clearly that doesn't, it doesn't, protect, resource consumption of the controller. And you could generalize this, and actually there was a proof of concept that we did where basically we wrapped all of the MD-SAL DOM things in documents, right, in XML documents, and then basically literally just ran Java X queries over it.
How well did it perform?
We didn't test it very well for that point of view.
Just a data point, the depth parameter is implemented in draft 15.
Okay.
And unlike the spec, it actually allows for depth more than 64K. The spec says only 64K. We actually implement any integer. If the need is there.
I think we have bigger problems if we need a 65K depth parameter in order to go further down into the tree. That's I like to make fun of Windows for having too short a file name, or for path name property, but I think 64K in terms of number of levels of hierarchy is probably reasonable. So you do this at the RESTCONF thing outside the controller. You could do it on the DOM inside. But I think the question is, how does this perform? And is the depth parameter performant because I think the depth parameter as it was implemented in draft 02, and I think it was the reason it was removed, because it literally did the whole query and then pruned it.
Yeah, and that goes to my point that RESTCONF is just an access application, so there is not much it can do unless we push this down further down the stack. And eventually
I'm not necessarily saying this needs to be an extension to RESTCONF. I'm just saying we need a way to get the effect of having a query over the results that would have returned by RESTCONF.
Right. So RESTCONF currently what it does, it's gonna read all the data obviously, and then as it is writing it out to either XML or in JSON, it simply skips traversing deeper than the specified level. Now, if we want to address the read part of it, obviously then the DOM read transaction read obviously needs to grow a parameter, which I'm not sure how useful it's going to be, but since based on sharding layout you kind of need to push it down. And then if we choose to implement some sort of query filter language, then actually not going through reads, but turning that into a listener property is much better approach. And you would do a one-off listener registration, wait for the data store engine to calculate the result of that query, get a notification, kill the listener, and return the data. And there is an enhancement bug for that.
Why would that be a better solution than having?
Because it's more generalized, and you can actually use it to watch live data, not just one-off reads. So and we do have the need. So essentially this is a push-based model of processing, right? So if you do a data tree change listener, you get notification about the data moves towards you. Now, obviously, you can use that to implement any querying language you want to, and currently we write hard code to do that. Now, if we say that, okay, instead of taking a Yang instance identifier as the root of the listener, we specify an XPath query and expect the result of that XPath query to be delivered to the listener, and also the listener to be triggered whenever the result of that XPath query changes as the effect of some transaction committing on the data store. That obviously is going to have much higher value to all our applications.
Yeah, I mean, yes.
Because that's essentially what you want to do with RESTCONF.
Yes. I mean, internally applications also want to do it. It's just the penalty of not doing it internally is lower than the penalty of not doing it to RESTCONF.
If you disregard the amount of code you have to write.
Fair enough. Cool. So, are there any last? I mean, so I think we're sort of at time, and it sounds like the answer. I mean, the actions are basically, one, see how far we can get. With just depth equals limitation, limits, and then 2 is discussions of the simplest useful way to get some real querying, and I think that's I think that'll be really useful.
Yeah, I'll just note that draft 16 actually specifies XPath 1.0 as a possible query language. So I think we should, if we're implementing something, we should implement that.
I would tend to agree. Anything else? Okay, I'm going to send out a lot of these notes later on. I think Colin wrote up lots of things and thus ends up running lots of sessions. I think the next thing, actually, no, Ryan, you also get to help run the next one, right? Are you sure?
I don't want to replace it.
RESTCONF draft 16? No, we're not gonna replace it. All right, so I might ask Robert to get on stage. So I think the next thing that I want to talk about was essentially how we're going to do about the migration to RESTCONF draft 16, which presumably will be RESTCONF RFC. Although I don't know, Jan, can you? Do we know when the RFC version of RESTCONF is likely to happen? Do we have any ideas?
Yeah, it's going through the process. The area director review wasn't really thrilling, and it was something like an 8-page document. And version 15 and 16 are in fact incompatible. So hopefully that will happen after the next RETF, which is I think in October or November somewhere. So probably this year or early next year. But I wouldn't hold my breath knowing RETF.
Do we want to go to 16 at all?
Yeah, so are we on that topic now?
No, I'm going to go get coffee, and I'm actually going to take the time to go downstairs. So I'll probably be back in 5 minutes, if that's because I think we start in 2 minutes here. But I need coffee, so
yep.
This will be the topic next, and let's let people.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, I think I mean, these are the interesting questions are, when does it make sense to move? What does it make sense to move to? Should we hold off until it's standardized? So that kind of thing.
Well, yeah. Okay. Yeah, let's follow up after coffee, right?
Yeah.